All right. Welcome to the inaugural first episode of Michael's Matchup Guides, where we're going to be going through a bunch of common modern matchups as well as some uncommon ones eventually. But going through a lot of these matchups, talking about things like sideboarding options, what your game plan should be, what you're looking out for, uh, everything that has to do with a specific matchup, mostly for Grixis Shadow, Demir, Jund, stuff like that. But we're also going to go over some common encounters and occurrences for other options, like your Stoneblade Shadow decks, your Esper Shadow, Mardu, anything like that. But I just wanted to do this instead of doing like a typed out sideboard guide. I don't like sideboard guides. I don't use them, but people are constantly asking for like how you board matchups, what your plan is. So I thought this would be a more fun, interactive, showing way of doing that without having to go through the boredom of just like typing up, -2 thought C's, +2 engineered explosive, blah, blah, blah. So we're going to try to get out like a couple of these each week, maybe more if it's highly requested. But this is just like the starting episode, see how it goes. So for the first one, I wanted to go through the Crashing Footfalls matchup, the Teamer Rhinos, Crashcade, whatever you want to call the deck. The deck that revolves around trying to get to turn 3 to start using cascade spells like Shardless Agent and Violent Outburst to cascade into Crashing Footfalls, get themselves 2 4/4 Trampling Rhinos, and just turn dudes sideways until you can't stand it anymore. So, first thing we'll go over is basically their general game plan. Then we'll talk about ours in the matchup. And then we'll get into some more specifics for different variations of Shadow. So the general game plan for them is to use cards like Dead and Gone, Fire and Ice, Evoke Fury, Brazen Borrower, the Petty Theft side of Brazen Borrower, the Stomp side of Bone Crusher Giant, things like that, to interact in the first turn or two to make sure the board's kind of clear, make sure you're tapping off your mana, so that on turn 3 through X, they can start resolving cascade spells to be able to get these Rhinos into play and use a little bit more of their disruption to close out the game by attacking it with these Rhinos. Obviously, there's backup plans like just hard casting Furies, Endurances, Bone Crushers, Brazen Borrowers, a little bit of burn ability with like the Fire and Ice's Prismari commands. But for the most part, the game plan is try to get these Rhinos rolling and get their opponent dead that way. So for us in the matchup, our general game plan is it varies. If you're on a counter version of Shadow, like one of your Grixis builds, blue-black, Esper, something like that, with access to Spell Pierce, Drown in the Loch, then your game plan is much more about not letting Rhinos resolve. You can typically beat the hard cast Bone Crushers and Brazen Bars with just your spot removal spells, but preventing your opponent from getting their big bodies on the board is often a much more reliable way of getting across the finish line. Usually their counter magic interaction is pretty limited, like the 4 copies of Force Negation, the 4 copies of Mystical Dispute in the sideboard, but like a turn 3 on the play Rhinos, like a turn 3 Shardless Agent, is often just going to be completely naked. So you've got all the interaction in the world to stop that. Things like Flusterstorm are fantastic options against the deck. But if you're on that counter build, usually you're more interested in holding up mana on turns that they can cast out Rhinos and trying to stop that way. If you're on one of the black-green X variations like Jund, and you have access to Tarmogoyf, then Goyf, Shadow, Scourge of the Skyclaves is your game plan. Your plan is to outmuscle these Rhinos, get bigger bodies on the board than they can attack through, and then start picking them off, getting your attacks in, putting the pressure on your opponent to catch up, and forcing these Rhinos into like Abyss mode where they got a chump block to survive. But since you're not going to be able to stop the Rhinos, it's often not worth holding up a bunch of mana to try to interact with them, especially on a turn where they're going to come off suspend, or you know about a shardless agent coming off, because those non-summoning sick Rhinos, or those summoning sick Rhinos, non-haste Rhinos, don't present a huge problem to you right there. You have the ability to untap, draw more cards, find interaction, but what you don't have the ability to do is attack if you've been holding out mana and not playing out your threats. So very, very different game plan between like Jund and Grixis. Grixis is typically going to have the smaller threats, the Dragon's Rage Channelers, the Ragavans, so you have to really take cards like Dead and Gone, Fire and Ice into consideration a lot more than Jund has to. Cards like Tarmogoyf for dodging 95% of the removal in the deck outside of like a Bounce Brazen Borrower or maybe a well-timed Endurance that it's able to hit one graveyard harder than the other. So that kind of gives an idea of the general main board plan. So let's go to the sideboard plan. So for the Rhinos decks, first off, you're looking at cards coming in like Blood Moon, Extra Endurances, Mystical Dispute if they're up against one of the counter-heavy versions. Jace the Mind Sculptor in a list like this is fine. We'll kind of go through a couple of these lists to show some different sideboard options. Leyline of Sanctity, maybe. I don't think it's a great card for the Rhinos players to bring in, but it wouldn't be the first time that I've seen them bring it in. Basically, this card's great if it hits hand disruption, but not being able to stop things like Chalice of the Void, Engineered Explosives, the counter spells. I don't personally think it's worth it. More Blood Moon, Mystical Dispute. So you're going to see like mostly the same cards across almost all these builds. Mystical Dispute, Blood Moon, Endurance, Magus of the Moon. Not a whole lot of variation that you have to worry about. For the most part, the Rhinos decks are very, very consistent and straightforward. Leyline of the Void, maybe. But you kind of get the idea. Blood Moon, Mystical Dispute, Force of Vigor, Leyline, Endurance. And that's about all you really need to think about. But for the most part, like Blood Moon and then Mystical Dispute, if you're on a blue variation of Shadow, and Endurance, pretty much only if you're on like Jund. It's okay against Dragon's Rage Channeler and Croxa if you're on that game plan post board. But for the most part, Endurance isn't that impactful of a card. Alright, so now our sideboard plan. We heard about their sideboard plan, bringing in a lot of these heavy hitters, the Blood Moons, the counter magic. You're typically going to see them boarding out of things like Prismari Command. Dead and Gone's not the greatest. Like, it's okay against like Ragavan, but it can go dead pretty quickly against Dragon's Rage Channeler. Bone Crusher Giant's okay, but not the greatest. Fury's okay, but not the greatest. So we get some trimming on stuff like that. So for our side, let's talk about the Grixis builds first, or any of your. This can apply to like any of your blue, black, X shadow builds. Anything that's got access to counter spells. So for the most part, our main deck is fairly good against Rhinos. We've got access to like shadows that can outgrow, pretty decent spot removal with Unholy Heat, Fatal Push. We've got Drown and Lock and sometimes Spell Pierce to interact with the Cascade spells. So we do have a lot of good tools. In the sideboard, a lot of the stock shadow lists are giving access to cards like Flusterstorm or Spell Pierce, Engineered Explosives that are all S-tier cards against Rhinos. Being able to sweep up all the ones on board with EE or being able to Flusterstorm a Cascade spell on the stack almost always means you're guaranteed to counter it. Like, I would say Flusterstorm's probably the best card in the matchup. Mainly because your Cascade opponent can't bring in their own Flusterstorm, so you don't have to worry about that. You can always count on Flusterstorm being at least a pay 3 because you're going to have the original Cascade spell, the Crashing Footfalls, and the Flusterstorm get cast. And if you're able to sneak another spell in there somewhere, then you could get that pay 4. Usually doesn't come up because they're kind of capping out at 5-6 mana most of the time. But it's nice to at least have the option there. Like maybe you get into a situation where they've got 6 mana and they go for a Cascade spell and you're able to Lightning Bolt them or Unholy Heat target something and Flusterstorm. So it's a good little trick to have in your back pocket just in case you need to get that Flusterstorm a little bit better. But for the most part, the Blue-Black X builds counter Footfalls is the game plan. They only have 4 copies in the deck. They can use like endurances to loop those Footfalls back in and cascade more. But for the most part, once the game gets to that point, you should have a pretty sizable board, or you should be able to find a way to push through lethal. They only have, like I said, the 4 copies of Footfalls. So between 4 Drown and Lock, 2 Flusterstorm, 1 or 2 Spell Pierce, you should have a reasonable chance of having counter magic for some number of them. Probably still going to have to fight through a couple Rhinos that land, but then you've got Unholy Heat, Drown and Lock. If you tapped off of it, kills Rhinos. Cards like Terminate are often okay to bring in. But let's break it down a little more specifically. So if I'm up against Rhinos, my board outs are usually something along the lines of like a Kroxa, because I don't want the Kroxa to get bounced by a Brazen Borrower, Dead and Gone, something like that, or the Graveyard to get nuked by Endurance, and all I got out of the Kroxa was 2 mana, make you discard your worst card in your hand. Dragon's Rage Channeler is one that I'll shave a lot. The Ragavans I'm a little more likely to keep in just because of their ability to snowball, but Dragon's Rage Channeler is a lot of times really bad against Endurance. If you get into a situation where you have to attack, they flash in an Endurance, nuke your yard, kill your Channeler. It's a pretty rough spot. Lightning Bolt. If you're running Lightning Bolt, I'll cut it most of the time. It's never going to kill a Rhino. So I want to make sure that all of my removal spells I have post-board are interacting profitably with a Rhino. So I'll keep in Fatal Pushes. I'll board out like a couple Unholy Heats if I've got Terminates to bring in. Same reason. Unholy Heat can kill a Rhino. Terminate will always kill a Rhino. So I prefer to err on the side of this is always going to kill it if I have the option. That's about it for the board out. So we're looking at like 2 copies of Unholy Heat, a Lightning Bolt, maybe 2 copies of Dragon's Rage Channeler, about 5 cards. And so I can go to my sideboard and see, okay, well, I've got EE, that's coming in. 2 Flusterstorms, those are coming in. Spell Pierce is coming in. And then I can bring in like a Terminate, a Mystical Dispute. If I want to board out more Unholy Heats and rely more on countering Rhinos instead of letting them resolve, I can do that. So I can just like swap out 2 Heats for 2 Terminates and then 2 more Heats for a Mystical Dispute and a Spell Pierce. Give myself a little ability to fight over their Mystical Disputes on the stack or their Petty Theft, something like that. But for the most part, like I said, Blue, Black, X, Shadow, I'm countering Cascade spells. So whatever I've got to do sideboard-wise to get the 2 Flusterstorms, the Spell Pierce, and the EE in. Those are my top priorities. I want to guarantee I get those in. If I miss out on a couple of the other pieces, I'm okay. A lot of it's preference. Like I said, I prefer to bring in stuff that guarantees kills a Rhino. Other people might prefer the Unholy Heats because of the cheaper mana cost. You just have to worry about Endurance a little bit more and playing around that. So, not a whole lot to say about that one. Let's go to the Jund Shadow matchup. So, with Jund Shadow, obviously you have a lot fewer ways to interact on the stack. You could sideboard things like Chalice of the Void, but for the most part, we're going with that same game plan I mentioned for the game one, your plan is to get things like Tarmogoyf, Shadow, Croxadown, bigger than Rhinos, and just put out good bodies on the board. You've got access to things like Battle Rage that can swing through. You've got more hand disruption to buy you a little bit more time. But as long as you're able to get to like Tarmogoyfs on the board, you should be okay most of the time. So board plan. For this particular variation of Jund, like I'm not a big fan of Dragon's Rage Channeler, so that would be a pretty easy cut for me post board. Lightning Bolt is fairly easy to cut. Same with Teamer Battle Rage. You don't want to run your Shadow into like a petty theft since you don't have the ability to stop a petty theft. So you're more reliant on just attacking through with good bodies instead of trying to cheese out with a Teamer Battle Rage. Riveteer's Charm's pretty weak here. The last thing you want to do is Riveteer's Charm into like Shardless Agent, Rhino, and have to hit the Shardless Agent. So any of those cards I could see coming out if you're on a more standard Jund build with like Scourge of the Skyclaves over Dragon's Rage Channeler. Scourge is a very good card in the matchup. Liliana the Veil is one you can cut if you're running it. Wrist you can cut. Like those slow, clunky 3-mana Planeswalkers, not the greatest point to be on here. Out of the sideboard, like I mentioned, the EEs. If you're running Chalice of the Void, that's a great one to bring in here. I'll bring in Fatal Push over something like an Unholy Heat, because again, Fatal Push guaranteed to kill a Rhino. Unholy Heat may kill a Rhino. The Terminates I'm bringing in. And that's about it out of this build. Like the EEs, Terminates, Fatal Push over something like, in this case, maybe a couple Dragon's Rage Channelers, Unholy Heats, or a couple Channelers, couple Bolts, Unholy Heat, chewing on some stuff like that. Maybe Riveteer's Charm, especially if I'm on the draw. I want to board out Riveteer's Charm. On the play, there's a little bit more use, just because your opponent goes for that turn 3 Shardless Agent. You can let the Footfalls resolve, then cast your Riveteer's Charm, sack a Rhino, and then they get the Shardless Agent. So it's not as dead on the draw or on the play. Still pretty bad. I probably wouldn't recommend it. I'm not a huge fan of running 4 Riveteer's Charm to begin with, but again, this is supposed to be a general guide, not a my deck specific guide. So let's go through some other card options here. We talked about like the stock Grixis builds. Maybe you're on like a Grixis build with a little more counter magic. Like here we got 2 Flusterstorm, 2 Spell Pierce, plus Mystical Dispute, and the 4 Drowns. For the most part, that's the same. Just Flusterstorm, Spell Pierce, EE, Mystical Dispute. I want access to like any of those. These are pretty stock. So let's talk about Jund a bit more. So if I'm on Jund with Dauthi Voidwalker, that's an excellent card to bring in these matchups. You have the ability to exile your opponent's Cascade spell, then untap, sack your Dauthi, and get your own Cascade spell. So you get your 8 power Rhinos to combat their 8 powers of Rhinos. In a build like this, Wrenn and 6 is pretty weak. We've got, like I said, the Terminates, Culling Ritual, Engineered Explosives. Any of those cards are great to bring in. So we've got a little bit of that sweeper effect that doesn't really kill our guys. Like Culling Ritual, I would try to make sure that you don't overextend your board into it. Let's see. Veil of Summer is one that you can bring in. It's good against Petty Theft, Fire and Ice, but not so great against the rest of the deck. Kind of depends on if you have more stuff that you want to bring out. Talked about EE, talked about most of these cards. Chalice of the Void, like I said, great one to bring in. You've got like Dismember, you can keep that in because it's always killing Rhinos. Street Wraith is one you can board out. And that pretty well sums up everything. So let's talk about play patterns a little bit here. So if you're on Grixis or Blue Black X, then more often than not, the play patterns involve something like turn one, hand disruption, or Ragavan. Maybe it gets dealt with, maybe it doesn't. But you're looking at things like your opponent icing down your land to tap you off counter spells. So having fetches untapped or uncracked if you've got Spell Pierce or Flusterstorm is really nice. Let's say you've got a hand of like a couple lands, Ragavan, Flusterstorm, something else, Drown in the Lock, whatever. And you've got the option for what you're going to do on turn one. I would almost always recommend getting Steam Vents for your Ragavan so that your second land you can play an untapped or uncracked fetch. So if your opponent taps down your Steam Vents to tap you off of Drown in the Lock, you can still fetch and shock off of that that other land to cast your Flusterstorm or Spell Pierce or whatever. I just wouldn't force a 2-mana spell there, or force something like I wouldn't fetch off the second land and then play a 1-drop and hold that other land open to be able to ice it down. I would try to keep that up and play around ice as much as possible. Then once it gets to like turn 3, 4, 5, when you've got the mana to cast your spells, it depends on what. I would try to keep up 1 mana more than your counter spell at all times. So if you've got a Drown in the Lock, I'd try to hold 3 mana open. If you've got a Flusterstorm, 2 mana, 2 blue mana, just give yourself the ability to play around ice if you can. If you can't, or you're in a position where you don't need to, like say I've got a Chalice of the Void out and my opponent's tapped off of Petty Theft, then I'll go ahead and use all my mana to deploy my threats. If I'm on like Sultai or something. But if I don't have that Chalice, I don't have that backup protection, then I'm going to try to keep up 1 more than my counter magic so I don't get got by ice into Cascade Spell. Let's go back to the Grixis list real quick. Alright, so other than that, opening hands you're really looking for out of Grixis, if you're on the play, Ragavan is your best 1-drop by a mile, because their only interaction they're often going to have is like 2 or 3 copies of Dead and Gone. It's not as often you're seeing the full 4 copies anymore, so being able to get that advantage on mana aggressively is extremely nice. I would not keep a hand if it doesn't have at least 1 counter spell of some sort. It doesn't really matter which one between Spell Pierce, Flusterstorm, and Drown in the Lock. I just want at least 1. You give yourself time to draw into another, but making sure you've got that first Cascade spell covered. The exception would be if you've got a hand with like Ragavan, Hand Disruption, Engineered Explosives, or like Shadow, Hand Disruption, Engineered Explosives. Those hands are often good enough as you're able to strip a couple Cascade spells, get down the EE to wipe up the Rhinos on board, and you have a reasonable threat to get you across the finish line. But for the most part, counter spells are where you want to be at. If you're on a Jund build or a Black-Green X Shadow build, then I'm really looking for one of my sizable threats, whether it be Shadow or Goyf, and Hand Disruption. More often than not, if you're relying on like a blind Chalice or a blind EE, you're going to have to deal with Brazen Borrowers, Force of Negations, all that stuff. So I would try my best to keep a hand with Hand Disruption and a threat, and then preferably some piece of interaction. But Hand Disruption and threat are the 2 primary pieces that you want access to. If you've got some sort of removal for Rhinos, it's like a plus. But if you don't have a clock and you give your opponent extra draw steps, they're going to find a way to get out of it. So the most important thing is a clock. And the most important thing you can pair with your clock is hand disruption to keep your clock around, keep it going. For the other variations of Shadow, like let's take a look at something like Shadow Blade. Sure. So for variations like this, cards like Prismatic Ending are really good to have in post board. Just 1 mana, exile a Rhino. Stubborn Denial is fantastic. So you see like Flusterstorm, Spell Pierce, Stubborn Denial. Any of those are going to be great options in dealing with a Rhino. For a deck like this, getting access to Stoneforge and then putting in like a Cauldron Complete or a Batter Skull is really good. Cauldron Complete especially because it turns on Stubborn Denial. But Batter Skull is a reasonable option if you need to like block a Rhino, bounce the Batter Skull, put the Batter Skull back in, have that continued presence on board. Like Fatal Pushes are great. Teferi Time Reveler, obviously out of one of your blue, white, black, X Shadow builds is S tier. March of Otherworldly Light, solid. Look at something like Mardu. Again, Prismatic Ending, great piece you can be on. If you're running the Ranger Captain of Eos, that's a good card half the time against Rhinos. One of my big adverses, or what's the word for it? Oppositions to Ranger Captain of Eos is the fact that it's 3 mana, so 50% of the time you're going to be on the draw, in which case 3 mana is going to be too slow for your opponent's Cascade spell. So just something to keep in mind there if you're really relying on a hand with Ranger Captain. If you're on the play, it might be good enough. If you're on the draw, it's probably not going to be. What else do we have? Sultai, again, just counter spell variations. You've got like Engineered Explosives, boarding out things like Grist, Dress Down. Board out Assassin's Trophy, Grim Flayer, some number of that stuff. But that kind of sums up most of it. So I guess the last thing would be play versus draw. Kind of touched on it with Ragavan being a lot worse on the draw because it gives your opponent access to things like Fire and Ice and Stomp off their Bone Crusher to interact. So I'd be a little more likely to shave Ragavans, some number of Ragavans on the draw, or prioritize casting my Hand Disruption on turn 1 over Ragavan. For a lot of these other variants, like the Black-Green X variants, I'm really looking for Hand Disruption on the draw. Like, Ragavan's going to be tier 3 card on the draw, but Hand Disruption's always going to be fantastic. Especially if I can curve like Hand Disruption into Dothy or Hand Disruption into Tarmogoyf, something like that, to kind of get that 1-2 punch early. But I think that's about it for the matchup. The only other thing is Blood Moon. Try your best to not get got. So with a lot of the blue variations, they're not running basic islands right now. So you really want to make sure that you're in a position, and it's going to be 10 times more important on the draw than on the play. But on the draw, you really need to be careful about not letting your opponent go like end of turn, Violent Outburst into untapped Blood Moon. So your best ways of combating that are like Hand Disruption for the Blood Moon, or Flusterstorm for like the Cascade spell into Drown in the Loch or Spell Pierce for the Blood Moon. So there may be a situation where if you've got out a Shadow or something and your opponent goes for an end of turn Violent Outburst, you might just have to let it resolve to not let yourself be dead to Blood Moon. It's a little bit less likely out of like the Footfalls decks than it is out of like Murktide or something like that to bring in the Blood Moons. but it's still something to keep an eye out for. If you're in Jund, then the basic forest is a little bit better, but obviously if you're on like Croxes and stuff, it can still be very difficult. So you just have to decide if that's something that you're okay running into issues with. Seasoned Pyromancer out of any of the builds can be a great card to combat Blood Moons. If you're wanting to run a... what's the card? It's 1 in a black, destroy a creature, enchantment, lose life equal to its CMC. You can run that. Break the Ice, maybe. No, that doesn't sound right. I don't know. I'll remember it at some point. But if you want to run that, that can be an option to help combat Blood Moon. Just make sure you're fetching up your basic swamp early. Other than that, yeah, I don't think there's much else to go over with that matchup. Kind of talked about some of the cards to bring in, some of the cards to keep an eye out for. The only other thing I can think of is don't put yourself in a position to be dead to one effect removing a blocker. Like, don't rely on one single blocker to be able to stop your opponent. They've got access to, like, Otawara, 4 Fire and Ice, 2 or 3 Dead and Gone, 4 Brazen Borrower. It is not difficult for their deck to remove a blocker. So if you put yourself in a position where, okay, my opponent's got 2 cards in hand, I've got 2 shadows. If I attack with 1, they're not quite dead, but I'm dead on the crackback, but I've got this shadow. Probably putting yourself in a position to get blown out by one of those effects. So if you have the chance or the option to play a little conservatively in that spot, I probably would. Make your opponent have like the running remove blockers instead of just 1. And then maybe you can make your removal spells work a little bit better for you. But other than that, hope this video was informative. Don't know what the next one will be on yet, but we'll get to it when we get to it. Have this one uploaded pretty quickly. And let me know, obviously, in the comments below if there's anything that I didn't mention, if there's something that you found that helps you, if there's any game plan or sideboard plan that you found particularly useful. But the big asterisk I want to give here is always, 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 always take your own personal accounts and experience into play and into consideration more than some dude on the internet telling you to like board in this, board out that. Because at the end of the day, I'm going to play my cards differently than you're going to play your cards. So my game plans are what I've come to with trial and error that work for me. They might not work for you if we're using different decision making. But I'm hoping that this video series will be a way to show, like, these things are what I think about. This is what I take into consideration. Maybe it'll help give you an extra perspective, as people in chat always help me get extra perspectives in matchups. So this is just a series about possibilities and ideas that you have access to. It's not meant to be a definitive, you have to do this, you can't do this. No, it's all about presenting options. So hopefully some of these options will help you out and help improve your matchups. And we'll look forward to the next one. Adios for now.